The day Mamie Gentry rode into Hollow Creek, Texas, with nothing but a carpetbag, a bruised heart, and a reputation she hadn't entirely earned. The whole town stopped what it was doing and stared like they'd never seen a woman arrive alone on a Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1882. She sat straight-backed on the buckboard she'd hired from the stage depot in Abilene, her dark hair pinned tight beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, her green eyes sharp and unapologetic as she scanned the single unpaved main street of the town that was supposed to be her fresh beginning. The Mercantile had a porch full of men who didn't bother hiding their curiosity. The women near the dry goods store pulled their shawls a little tighter and leaned toward each other with murmuring mouths. A dog scratched itself beside the livery. The flag above the sheriff's office hung still in the heavy summer heat. Mamie had heard about Hollow Creek from a woman on the stage who said it was a decent town, growing, the kind of place where a person could start over if they kept their head down and their hands busy. She needed both those things badly. She was 26 years old, recently divorced by a husband who had convinced a judge in Fort Worth that she was unstable and unfit, mostly because she had refused to be quiet about the fact that he was stealing from the families he was supposed to be representing as a land broker. The divorce had gone through faster than she'd expected. The loss of her small son, William, had not come faster at all. It had come like an axe through wood, sudden and total and irreversible. The judge had awarded custody to Thomas Gentry, citing her alleged instability, and Mamie had walked out of that courthouse with nothing but her name and the quiet, ferocious determination not to let it kill her. She was going to rebuild. She was going to prove herself fit and stable and capable, and then she was going to find a way to bring her boy home. The buckboard stopped in front of a narrow building with a freshly painted sign that read Hollow Creek Boarding House, Proprietress Mrs. Ida Bell. Mamie climbed down, paid the driver what she owed him, and carried her carpetbag up 3 wooden steps to the door. Inside, Ida Bell was exactly the kind of woman Mamie had hoped she might be. She was round and warm and smelled of biscuits, with gray hair and a manner that suggested she had heard plenty of hard stories and would not be rattled by one more. She showed Mamie a clean room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the back lot where chickens moved in slow circles. She told her the rate was 50 cents a week, meals included, and that she didn't allow gentlemen callers past 7 in the evening, which Mamie found completely agreeable since she had no intention of entertaining any gentlemen at all. That first night, sitting on the edge of her narrow bed with the sounds of Hollow Creek settling into quiet around her, Mamie took out the small photograph she kept folded inside her Bible. William, at 3 years old, squinting into summer sunlight, holding a wooden toy horse that Thomas had given him and that Mamie had painted red because William liked red. He would be 4 now. She pressed her thumb to the photograph and made herself a promise, the same one she made every night, that she would not stop until she had him back. The next morning she went looking for work. The hotel restaurant needed a woman to help with serving and light cooking, and the proprietor, a thin man named Mr. Crane, didn't ask too many questions about where she'd come from. She started that same afternoon, and by the end of her first week, she knew the names of most of the regular faces in Hollow Creek, and most of them knew hers. It was at the end of her 2nd week that she first encountered Oscar Alden, though encountered was perhaps too gentle a word for what actually happened. She was carrying a full tray of supper plates across the restaurant's main room when the door swung open hard enough to strike the wall, and the man who came through it was moving fast and not watching where he was going. The tray went one way. The plates went several ways. The roasted chicken and the green beans and the gravy went directly onto the front of Mamie's apron, and partially onto the boots and lower trousers of the man who'd caused the collision. She looked up expecting to feel irritated, and instead found herself looking at a face that was too honest to be called handsome in any refined way, but was striking in the way that weathered, open landscapes are striking. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or two more. With dark hair that curled slightly under the brim of a hat he was already pulling off his head. His eyes were the color of creek water in afternoon light, somewhere between gray and blue, and they were looking at her with an expression of immediate and genuine mortification. "Lord," he said, "Lord, I am sorry, I am so sorry. Are you burned? Did anything hot get on you?" "I am not burned," Mamie said, assessing the wreckage around her feet, "but I believe that chicken is finished." "I'll pay for it," he said immediately. He was already crouching, picking up pieces of the broken plates. "I'll pay for everything. I wasn't looking. That was entirely my fault. Stop picking that up, you'll cut yourself." He stopped, looking up at her from his crouch with those gray-blue eyes, and something in his expression was so earnest that she nearly smiled despite herself. "Oscar Alden," he said, standing and extending his hand, apparently deciding that introductions were the next logical step. "I run the Alden Ranch out east of town. I really am sorry, ma'am. Mamie Gentry." She shook his hand because refusing would have been rude, and she didn't feel like being rude, only because being rude would have required more energy than she had. "I work here." "I know," he said, and then appeared to immediately regret that he'd said it, as though it sounded like he'd been paying her closer attention than a stranger ought. He cleared his throat. "I mean, I've seen you here before. I eat here most Friday evenings. Then you should know to watch for the tray." He had the decency to look ashamed. "You're right. I should have. I will from now on." She sent him to a table, got the mess cleaned up with the help of the kitchen boy, and brought Oscar Alden a fresh supper herself because it was her job, and she was determined to do her job well regardless of how flustered she was feeling. She set the plate down in front of him without a word. He thanked her with a gravity that seemed disproportionate to the delivery of a meal, but which she privately found rather touching. He left her a tip that was larger than the cost of the broken plates. She didn't think too much about it after that. She had other things to think about. The weeks passed with the particular texture of days that are hard but productive. Mamie served meals and saved her earnings and wrote careful, formal letters to a lawyer in Fort Worth named Mr. Ephraim Coles, who had agreed to take her case regarding William on a payment plan. Mr. Coles wrote back with cautious optimism, and the suggestion that demonstrating stable employment and respectable circumstances over a period of 6 months would significantly strengthen her position before the court. 6 months felt like a very long time when her boy was growing without her. She kept working. She kept saving. She became a fixture of the hotel restaurant in the way that capable, quiet people become fixtures, indispensable and gradually trusted. Mr. Crane gave her a small raise after 6 weeks. Ida Bell began leaving extra biscuits outside her door on the mornings. She knew Mamie had worked a long shift. Oscar Alden came in every Friday evening and sat at the same corner table, and Mamie served him because it was her section, and he was always polite and always left a generous tip, and never once caused any further accidents with the door. He asked her questions sometimes, small careful questions, the kind that a person asks when they want to know more about someone but are trying not to seem presumptuous. Where was she from originally? Did she find Hollow Creek agreeable? Had she tried the apple pie because it was very good? She answered him in the way she answered most things those days, honestly but briefly, keeping the deeper currents of her life below the surface where they couldn't be used against her. It was on a Friday in late October, when the Texas air had finally stopped being brutal and was moving toward something almost comfortable in the evenings, that things shifted between them in a way that was small but permanent. She'd had a hard day. A letter had arrived from Mr. Coles that morning explaining that Thomas had hired a new attorney, one considerably more aggressive, and that they would need to respond to several new allegations before the end of November. She'd read the letter twice in the kitchen before her shift started, and then she'd folded it up and put it in her apron pocket and gone to work because there was nothing else to do. By the time Oscar Alden settled into his corner table that evening, she had been on her feet for 9 hours, and when she set his coffee down in front of him, her hand was not entirely steady. He noticed. She could see him notice the slight tightening of attention in his expression. He didn't say anything right away. He let her take his order and bring his food and fill his coffee a second time. But when she came to clear his plate, he looked up at her with a directness that was different from his usual careful politeness. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am fine, thank you." "You don't seem fine," he said. "And I don't say that to be impertinent. I say it because you seem like a woman who is working very hard to seem fine, and sometimes that's harder than just being fine." Mamie looked at him for a moment. The restaurant was mostly empty at this hour. The kitchen sounds were distant and muffled. The lamplight was warm and low. "I received a difficult letter this morning," she said, because something about his directness made it easier to be direct herself. "I'm sorry," he said. "Is there anything I can do?" The question was so simply offered without pretense or expectation that it caught her off guard. She was not used to being asked that. She was used to being suspected of things or lectured at or managed. She was not used to someone just asking if they could help. "No," she said, "but thank you for asking." He nodded and left it at that, which was exactly the right thing to do. She thought about that exchange more than she expected to over the following days. There had been no flirtation in it, no attempt to ingratiate himself. He had simply seen that she was struggling and offered to help. It was so straightforward that it nearly made her sad, because she had lived for years in a world where people's motives were rarely as simple as their words, and she had forgotten that simple honesty was still possible. November arrived with wind and the smell of wood smoke, and Mamie wrote her response letter to Mr. Coles and sent it with enough money to cover the next round of filing fees, and tried not to calculate too precisely how many months she still had before the money ran out entirely. It was around this time that circumstances conspired to change her relationship with Oscar Alden in a way that neither of them had planned. The Hollow Creek Ladies' Charitable Society held a harvest supper each November, a long-standing tradition that involved the whole town and considerable cooking, and Ida Bell, who was on the organizing committee, had volunteered Mamie's help in the kitchen without entirely asking Mamie first. Mamie had agreed because she liked Ida, and because refusing would have seemed ungrateful, and also because she genuinely liked to cook. The supper was held in the large open space behind the church, with tables set out beneath a November sky that was clear and cold and absolutely strung with stars. Half the town came. Oscar Alden came, she noticed, with his ranch hand, a cheerful red-haired young man named Fletcher who apparently ate everything within reach and apologized for nothing. Mamie spent most of the evening in the serving area, but had a moment near the end of the night when the rush died down and she stepped outside for a breath of cold air. She was standing at the edge of the gathered light, looking up at the stars, when she heard footsteps on the dry grass behind her. Miss Gentry. Oscar's voice was recognizable by now. She turned. He was carrying 2 tin cups of cider, and he held one out to her with the particular diffidence of a man who had worked out an excuse to approach someone, and was hoping the excuse was acceptable. "You've been working all evening," he said. "I thought you might want something warm." She took the cup. The cider was spiced, and the warmth of it went straight through her cold fingers. "Thank you." They stood for a moment in the kind of companionable quiet that she hadn't experienced in a long time. Stars above them, voices and fiddle music from behind them, the vast dark Texas landscape around them. "You run the ranch alone?" She asked because she realized she'd answered his questions but rarely asked any of her own. "My father left it to me when he passed 3 years ago," he said. "It's not a large spread, but it's enough. I have Fletcher and 2 other hands. We run cattle mostly, some horses." "Do you like it?" He considered this with genuine thoughtfulness, which she was coming to understand was characteristic of him. He didn't answer questions automatically. He actually thought about them first. "I like the work," he said. "The land I love. The solitude gets heavy sometimes, but yes, I like it." "The solitude gets heavy," she repeated softly, not to him, more to herself. "Does it for you?" he asked. She looked at him. There were things she was not ready to tell him yet, the the story of William and Thomas and the courthouse in Fort Worth and all the machinery that had ground her life into its current shape. But she could tell him this much. "I am alone in ways I didn't expect to be," she said, "but I am working on changing that." He nodded as though this made perfect sense, which she supposed to him it did. "I believe you will," he said simply, and turned back to look at the stars. That phrase settled in her somewhere quiet and warm, the way a good coal settles in a stove. "I believe you will." She began to trust him after that. Not quickly, not carelessly, but in the measured way of someone who has learned that trust is a resource that must be allocated wisely. She began answering his questions more fully. She let him sit and talk with her for a few minutes at the end of her shift on Friday evenings when the restaurant was closed and she was wiping down the last of the tables. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about coming to Texas at 20 with a husband who had seemed decent before he showed her what decent was covering up. She told him about working as a seamstress in Fort Worth and then taking in boarders and then, when things got bad, working at a dry goods counter while Thomas became someone she no longer recognized. She didn't tell him about William yet. That was still too close, too raw to hand to anyone. He told her about growing up on the Alden ranch, about his father who had been tough and fair, about his mother who had died when Oscar was 12, and whom he still missed with the uncomplicated grief of someone who had loved someone straightforwardly and lost them absolutely. He'd been briefly engaged at 24 to a woman named Clara who had decided that ranch life was not what she wanted and had gone to live with her sister in San Antonio, and he spoke of this without bitterness, only with the mild regret of a door that had closed quietly. In December, the first hard cold came, and the restaurant added a pot of soup to the menu and business picked up, and Mamie was busier than ever, which was good because it kept her from thinking too much about Christmas. William had loved Christmas. He had been too young to understand it properly but had loved the lights and the excitement, and she had made him a small stocking and filled it with a peppermint stick and a carved wooden figure and a little red ball. She wondered if Thomas would do anything like that. She doubted it. Thomas had not been the peppermint stick type. She received another letter from Mr. Coles in the second week of December. This one was better. Thomas's new attorney had overreached in his allegations, and the judge in Fort Worth had noted the lack of substantive evidence behind the claims of instability. The case was not won, but the ground had shifted. Mr. Coles believed that if Mamie could demonstrate continued stability through the spring, they would be in an excellent position to petition for a custody modification. She read the letter standing in the kitchen of the boarding house before Ida Bell came down to start breakfast, and she cried for about 3 minutes, very quietly with her hand pressed over her mouth. Not sad crying, the other kind. Then she washed her face and went to work. She told Oscar about William that Friday evening. She hadn't planned to. But he had come in looking tired himself, with a long scratch on his forearm from some fence wire that had gotten loose, and she brought him his coffee and sat down across from him in the empty restaurant because there were no other customers and she was done pretending that this wasn't a friendship. "I have a son," she said. "His name is William. He's 4 years old. He lives in Fort Worth with his father." Oscar's expression did not shift into pity or judgment, the two things she'd braced herself for. It shifted into something attentive and careful. "You're trying to get him back," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, I have a lawyer. It's slow work." "How old is he in your photograph?" Because she'd taken it out once to look at it while waiting for a late table and he had seen her with it, and he had not asked then and she had appreciated the restraint. 3, she said. "That was taken the summer before everything fell apart." "He looks like you around the eyes," Oscar said. "I noticed that when I saw it. I wasn't prying." "I know you weren't," she said because she did know. He was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything I can do to help? Honestly, Mamie, I'm not asking to be polite." And there it was again, that simple directness, that unaffected offer of practical assistance that she still found faintly disarming every time. "You can't really help with this," she said. "It's legal work and time and money, and I'm managing all three." "All right," he said, but I'm here if something changes." She walked home through the cold December night feeling less alone than she had felt in nearly 2 years, which was a remarkable thing, and which she turned over in her mind all the way to Ida Bell's front door. January was hard. January in Hollow Creek was gray and dry and relentless, the kind of month that wears people down in small ways. The restaurant was quieter. Mamie had more time to think, which was not always a gift. She thought about William constantly, that particular gnawing thought that lives in the chest of any parent separated from their child, that low, persistent note of loss. She threw herself into her work with a focus that Mr. Crane noticed and remarked upon. He gave her more responsibility, let her order the food supplies, which required keeping careful lists and doing arithmetic, all of which she was good at, and had rarely been given credit for being good at. Oscar came by on Fridays still, but also on the occasional Wednesday now, which was not his previous pattern, and she noted this but did not comment on it. She was not ready to comment on it. She was not sure she was ready for what commenting on it would mean, but she was aware of him. She was aware of the way he moved through a room with the quiet self-assurance of a man who was at home in his body and his work. She was aware of his hands, which were rancher's hands, broad and calloused, and which were always gentle with things, with the coffee cup, with the brim of his hat. She was aware of the way he laughed when Fletcher said something ridiculous, which was a good laugh, full and genuine, the kind that made the room feel slightly warmer. She was falling in love with him, and she knew it, and she was terrified. The terror was specific. She had loved Thomas once, or thought she had, and look at the shape that had left her life in. More than that, she had a battle ahead of her, a legal battle that required her to appear above reproach, stable, focused, not distracted by romantic feelings. She could not afford to be reckless. William's future was on the scale. She was therefore very careful. She was friendly and warm and honest with Oscar in the way that a person can be friendly and warm and honest with someone they trust. But she kept the deeper thing held back, locked behind the practical necessity of her circumstances. He was patient. Whether he was patient because he understood or simply because he was by nature a patient man, she couldn't entirely tell. But he did not push. He did not press. He came and ate his supper and talked with her when she had time and asked careful questions and left generous tips and did not ask her for anything she wasn't ready to give. February came, and with it a development that Mamie had not anticipated. Thomas Gentry arrived in Hollow Creek. She saw him from the window of the restaurant on a Wednesday morning, standing on the street in front of the hotel with his hat in his hand, looking up at the sign, and her blood went cold the way it does when you see a thing that shouldn't be where it is. He'd found her. She didn't know how. She suspected someone in Abilene had talked, the driver she'd hired perhaps, or someone at the stage depot. Thomas had money and money could find things out. She stayed very still for a moment, watching him. He was a tall man, Thomas Gentry, well-dressed in the way that men who need to seem prosperous are well-dressed, with a careful mustache and boots that were always clean. He did not look cruel, which was the hardest thing about him. He looked like a reasonable man, which was the armor he wore. She straightened her apron and went out to meet him in the street because she was not going to let him come into the restaurant and stage whatever he had come to stage on the ground of her employment. "Thomas," she said. "Mamie." He looked her over with the assessing quality she remembered. "You look well. Why are you here?" "I wanted to talk to you," he said, reasonably. "Without lawyers between us. There is nothing reasonable you have to say to me that can't be said through Mr. Coles. I want to discuss a settlement," he said. "I'm willing to allow you regular visits with William, monthly, supervised." She heard the word visits and something in her chest went entirely rigid with refusal. "I want custody, Thomas, not visits." "That isn't going to happen," he said, with the pleasant certainty of a man who has always had institutions on his side. "You are a divorced woman working as a restaurant server in a frontier town. The court will not give you custody." "The court may surprise you," she said, and turned to go back inside. "Mamie," his voice changed slightly, just enough to be a warning. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm trying to be fair." You are trying to seem fair, she said. Those are different things. I know the difference now. She went inside and spent the rest of the day with her hands shaking slightly, not from fear but from the hot, focused anger of a woman who knows she is right and knows how much it still costs to be right. She told Oscar that evening, when he appeared at the restaurant at what had become a slightly earlier time than usual, as though something in him had registered that Wednesday was a difficult day without being told specifically why. She told him what had happened, and he listened to all of it: the arrival, the conversation, the offer of visits, her refusal. And when she was done, he did not immediately tell her what she should do or offer opinions on the legal situation. He simply said, "He doesn't know you very well if he thought that would work." She stared at him. "What?" "To offer you visits," he said. "He doesn't know who he's dealing with if he thought you'd settle for monthly supervised visits." Something about being seen that clearly and that correctly by someone made her throat tighten. "No," she said, "he doesn't know me at all." "Does he know you have a lawyer? Mr. Coles has communicated with his attorney." "Yes." "Then let the lawyers handle it," Oscar said. "Don't negotiate with him directly. He's trying to get you away from the legal process where you have protections." She looked at him with genuine surprise. "That's exactly right. My father dealt with a lot of land disputes," he said, with a small, self-deprecating lift of one shoulder. "I learned early that the person who wants to talk without lawyers usually wants something the lawyers wouldn't allow." "You're smarter than people probably give you credit for," she said, and it came out softer than she intended, almost fond. And she saw him go very still for just a moment at the quality of it. "I've been told I'm just a cowboy," he said, and there was humor in it, but something underneath the humor too. "You've been told wrong," she said firmly. Thomas left Hollow Creek the next morning. Mamie watched the stage pull out from the window of her room at Ida Bell's, and she let herself breathe all the way down for the first time in 2 days. She wrote immediately to Mr. Coles, reporting the unsolicited visit and the proposed settlement offer. Mr. Coles responded that this was actually very helpful information, as it suggested Thomas was less confident in his legal position than his aggressive posture had indicated, and that they should proceed as planned. March arrived and the air softened, and the land around Hollow Creek turned green at its edges in the way that Texas land does in spring, with a hesitant beauty that feels like a question answered. Mamie planted a small kitchen garden behind the boarding house with Ida Bell's encouragement, tomatoes and beans, and a row of marigolds because she liked marigolds, and she had earned the right to plant something just because she liked it. Oscar found her there one Saturday afternoon when he'd come into town for supplies and had stopped at the boarding house for something. She wasn't sure what reason he'd given Ida Bell, and he'd been directed around the back. He came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her bonnet pushed back and her hands full of dark soil. She looked up and found him looking at her with an expression that was not complicated. It was entirely simple. It was the expression of someone looking at something they very much wanted to be near. "Your garden?" he asked. "My garden," she agreed. He crouched down and looked at the seedlings with the interest of a man who understood growing things. "Marigolds," he said. "I like them. They keep pests away from the vegetables," he said. "Good choice for practical reasons, too, not just because they're pretty." "I am pleased to be accidentally clever about it," she said, and he laughed, and there was that good warm laugh again filling the quiet afternoon air between them. He stayed for a while talking while she worked, and when she finally stood up and brushed the dirt from her skirt and her hands, he was still crouching, looking at the garden with a private smile. "Oscar," she said. He looked up. "I am not ready for what I think might be happening," she said, because she had decided that if she was going to be honest about everything else, she might as well be honest about this. "I have too much unfinished business, too much that has to be settled before I can give attention to anything else. Do you understand what I mean?" He rose to his full height and looked at her with those creekwater eyes, and he did not look hurt or impatient. He looked like a man who had expected this and respected it. "I understand completely," he said, "I'm not going anywhere, Mamie. I'm not that kind of impatient." "I know," she said. "That's why I told you." He nodded. He put his hat back on and touched the brim and walked back around the corner of the house and out to the street, and she looked down at her garden with her heart doing something complicated and not entirely unpleasant in her chest. April brought a letter from Mr. Coles that required her presence in Fort Worth. The hearing had been scheduled. The judge would hear both parties' arguments regarding custody modification in the first week of May. Mr. Coles was cautiously optimistic. He needed her there in person. She made arrangements with Mr. Crane, who grumbled but let her have the week she needed. She packed her carpetbag again, that same one she'd arrived with, and went to tell Ida Bell she'd be gone a week. Oscar was at the boarding house when she arrived. He'd been helping Ida Bell repair a section of porch railing that had rotted through, and he was on his knees with a hammer when Mamie came up the front steps, and he looked up and saw her face and the carpetbag and understood immediately. "The hearing?" he asked. "First week of May," she said. "I'm leaving day after tomorrow on the stage." He set the hammer down and stood, and there was a moment between them that was full of things neither of them said, which was all right because they both understood what was in the moment without saying it. "You'll do fine," he said. "I don't know that." "I do," he said simply. "I believe in you." It was such a quiet, absolute statement. No decoration, no performance, just a clean statement of faith from a man who meant what he said, and it moved through her like a current of warm water. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just come back." She took the stage to Fort Worth on a bright May morning, and arrived in the city with the particular mixture of dread and determination that had characterized every significant thing she'd done in the past 2 years. The city was larger than she'd let herself remember. Everything seemed bigger and louder than Hollow Creek, which had become comfortable to her in ways she hadn't noticed until she was outside of it. Mr. Coles was a small man with large spectacles and a manner of precise, unhurried competence that she found genuinely reassuring. He went over everything with her the night before the hearing, the evidence of her employment, her wages, her living situation, the letters of character that he had gathered from Mr. Crane and from Ida Bell and from Reverend Hughes, who ran the church in Hollow Creek, and who had written something so warm and curt that she'd had to read it twice to believe a man who barely knew her had written it about her. There was also a letter from Oscar Alden, which Mr. Coles mentioned almost in passing. He'd written to offer a character reference, and it had been included with the other materials. She had not asked him to do this. She had not even known he'd done it until Mr. Coles told her. "What did it say?" she asked. Mr. Coles cleared his throat and consulted his papers. "He writes that he has known you for approximately 7 months, that he has found you to be a woman of exceptional character and integrity, industrious, composed under difficulty, devoted to improving her circumstances, and that he believes without reservation that any child in her care would be fortunate. He signs it as a property owner and cattle rancher of Hollow Creek and includes a note that he would gladly appear in person if the court required it." She sat with that for a moment. He had written that. Without being asked, without telling her, he had simply done it because he thought it might help. The hearing lasted 2 days. Thomas's attorney made arguments that were confident but thinner than they had been in the original proceedings, and Mamie answered the judge's questions with the directness and steadiness that she had been practicing for 2 years. She told the truth, all of it. About the land fraud she had tried to expose, about Thomas's pressure on her to be silent, about the manufactured instability claim, about working and saving and building a life in Hollow Creek with the specific purpose of creating a stable home for her son. The judge was a gray-haired man with the tired eyes of someone who had heard many complicated things and was no longer impressed by confidence alone. He listened to both sides without visible reaction and said he would issue his ruling within 10 days. Mamie went back to Hollow Creek on the stage and worked her shifts at the restaurant and planted more things in her garden and waited. The ruling arrived on a Thursday morning, brought to her by Ida Bell, who had signed for the letter at the post office, and who stood with it in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. Mamie opened it at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the window and her hands perfectly steady, because she had decided the night before that whatever it said, she would be steady. The court found in her favor. Not full custody. The judge had stopped short of that, citing the disruption to the child of a sudden and complete change of circumstances. But he had modified the arrangement significantly. William was to spend 6 months of the year with Mamie, beginning in the summer. Thomas would have him for the remaining 6 months. The arrangement was to be reviewed again in 1 year, at which point full custody could be petitioned for. 6 months a year. Her boy for 6 months a year. She cried the way she had cried when the December letter came, quietly, hand over mouth, head bent. Then she washed her face and went to tell Ida Bell, who threw her arms around her and said things that were mostly incoherent but entirely warm. Then she went to work because it was a Thursday and she worked Thursdays. She waited until Friday evening. Oscar came in at his usual time, hung his hat on the peg by the door, settled into his corner table. She brought his coffee. She sat down across from him. The restaurant was quiet, just 2 other tables occupied, and she did not even try to be subtle about the fact that she had something to say. "I got the ruling," she said. She watched him go very still with the kind of attention that means something is important. "What did it say?" "He stays with me 6 months of the year, starting this summer." Oscar closed his eyes for a second, just a second, and when he opened them there was something in his face that she recognized because she'd felt it herself that morning. Relief so deep it was almost painful. "Mamie," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm so glad." "I know," she said again. And she covered his hand on the table with hers, just for a moment, and he turned his hand over and held hers carefully, like something worth being careful with. And the 2 of them sat there in the quiet Friday evening restaurant in Hollow Creek, with the lamplight warm around them, and a year of hard-won ground between them, and something new beginning in the space that all that ground had finally cleared. She drew her hand back after a moment because there were still tables to attend to and she was still at work, and he understood that perfectly, and sat back with a quiet smile that she had come to think of as specifically and exclusively his. "He's going to love Texas," Oscar said. "Kids love Texas," she laughed, and it was the first full laugh she'd given in longer than she could remember. "He's 4. He'll love anything with enough space to run in." "I have plenty of space," Oscar said, and then stopped as though he'd said more than he intended and looked at his coffee cup with the particular care of a man choosing his next words. "Oscar," she said. He looked up. "When William comes," she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, "I am going to need somewhere more than 1 room above a boarding house. I am going to need a proper home. I have enough saved for a modest rental perhaps, or—" "You could come to the ranch," he said. It came out before he'd clearly finished deciding to say it, and he looked at her steadily even though the color had risen slightly in his neck. "Not, I want to be clear about what I'm saying. The ranch house has 4 rooms. You and William would have your own space. It would be proper. I would not. I am not trying to suggest anything that isn't respectable." She considered him for a long moment. This man who had come through a door in September like a controlled catastrophe, who had asked her if she was all right on a hard day without expecting anything in return, who had written a letter to a court on her behalf without telling her, who had sat with her through months of difficulty with the patience of someone who understood that waiting was sometimes the only right thing to do. "Let me think about it," she said. "Take all the time you need," he said, and meant it entirely. She thought about it for 2 weeks. She thought about it carefully and without sentimentality, because the stakes were too high for sentimentality. She had William to think about, not just herself. Bringing her son into any situation that wasn't solid and good would be unacceptable. She thought about the kind of man Oscar had shown himself to be over the course of nearly 9 months. Steady, honest, patient, practical without being cold, kind without being soft. She thought about the fact that she trusted him, which was not a thing she had expected to be able to say about a man again, and the fact that she did felt significant enough to listen to. She went to the ranch on a Saturday. He showed her around with the manner of someone who is trying not to oversell something, because they don't want to seem like they're overselling it. The land was beautiful in a spare, wide-open Texas way, rolling grassland with a creek that ran along the eastern boundary, and a stand of cottonwood trees near the house that moved in the wind with a sound like breathing. The house was modest but solid, with a kitchen that had real room in it and a porch that looked west so that you could see the sunset straight on. He showed her the room that could be William's, a small square room with a window that looked out at the cottonwoods, and she stood in the doorway of it and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. "It's a good room for a boy," she said. "I thought so too," Oscar said from behind her. She turned. He was leaning against the hallway wall with his arms folded and his expression entirely open, all that patience and honesty right there on the surface. "If I come here," she said, "it has to be with the understanding that I am here as myself, not as someone's housekeeper, not as a woman who owes anything to anyone for the roof." "I know that," he said. "I have my own money and my own work and my own case to continue building. William's arrangement will be reviewed in a year, and I intend to petition for full custody. I know that too. And she paused. "I have feelings for you that I am not quite ready to act on because I have spent 2 years learning not to rush things." "I know," he said for the third time, and he was smiling now just slightly. "You know a lot," she said. "I know you," he said simply. "I've been paying attention." She moved to the ranch in the last week of May. Ida Bell cried a little and packed her a basket of biscuits for the road and extracted a promise that Mamie would come to Sunday dinner twice a month at least. Fletcher, Oscar's red-haired ranch hand, was delighted by the development in the uncomplicated way of someone who liked things to go well and saw no reason they shouldn't. The arrangement was respectable. Mamie had her own room. Oscar had his. There was a sitting room between them and a kitchen and the wide front porch, and all the honest air of two people who were doing things properly, because they both thought that doing things properly mattered. She cooked supper for the ranch hands on her evenings off from the restaurant, and they were uniformly grateful in the unself-conscious way of men who eat well and know it. She planted a proper garden along the south side of the house. She kept her own accounts and continued sending money to Mr. Cole's. She rode out with Oscar on Saturday mornings sometimes, on a brown mare he kept called Penny, who had good manners and a mild disposition, and they rode the perimeter of the ranch land in the early morning with the light coming sideways across the grass, and talked about everything and nothing. She found that she liked talking to him more than she had liked talking to most people in her life. He had opinions and they were usually worth hearing, but he held them with a kind of looseness, a willingness to change them in the face of better thinking, that she found rare and valuable. He listened to her, actually listened, not the way people listen when they are waiting to respond, but the way people listen when they are genuinely interested in what is being said. In early June, she drove to Abilene on the stage to meet the train that was bringing William. She stood on the platform in the June heat with her hands pressed together in front of her and watched the train come in, and when the passengers stepped off, she found herself scanning faces with a desperation that was physical, a tightening across her whole chest. And then there he was, a small boy in a blue jacket that was slightly too big for him, holding the hand of Thomas's housekeeper, Mrs. Pierce, who had been designated for the handoff, looking around the platform with 4-year-old alertness and no apparent distress. He was bigger than she'd let herself believe. He had Thomas's coloring, dark hair and fair skin, but he had her eyes. Oscar had been right about that. "William," she said, and her voice broke on it. He looked at her. A half-second of blankness, the terrible half-second of a child who isn't sure, and then recognition swept across his face like sunrise, and he pulled his hand from Mrs. pierces and ran at her across the platform, and she dropped to her knees right there on the boards and caught him and held him with her whole body and her whole heart, and the June heat and the train steam and the noise of the platform all became entirely irrelevant. "Mama," he said, muffled against her shoulder. She could not speak for a moment. She just held him. She introduced him to Oscar on the drive back from Abilene, stopping the wagon at the edge of a meadow so William could have a moment of running, because he'd been sitting still for hours and 4-year-olds were not built for extended sitting. Oscar crouched down on William's level when they met, hat in hand, and said hello in a voice that was easy and friendly and not at all the forced brightness that adults sometimes use with small children. William looked at him with the assessing intelligence of a small person who is working things out. "Do you have horses?" he asked. "I have 7 horses," Oscar said. William considered this information seriously. "Can I see them?" "First thing when we get home," Oscar said, and William nodded as though a satisfactory agreement had been reached. That summer was the best summer Mamie could remember in many years. The days had shape and warmth and purpose, mornings on the ranch and afternoons at the restaurant and evenings with William, who adapted to ranch life with the elastic enthusiasm of a child who finds everything new interesting. He named 2 of Oscar's horses, without asking permission, and without apparent concern that they already had names. Oscar allowed the new names to stand, at least when William was in earshot, and Mamie loved him for it in a way that surprised her with its depth. William followed Oscar around the ranch with the determined attachment of a small person who has identified someone worth following. Oscar bore this with complete equanimity, including William in small tasks that were safe and manageable, teaching him the names of things, explaining in simple terms how the ranch worked. He was never impatient with the endless questions. He was never performatively warm in a way that felt false. He was simply himself, and himself turned out to be someone a small boy could trust. She watched this from a distance sometimes, the 2 of them moving around the ranch in the late afternoon light, and felt something that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but some precise combination of both. The bittersweet awareness of happiness arriving in a form she hadn't dared to picture. She had not kissed him. She had thought about it increasingly with the directness she applied to most things. She thought about it when they sat on the porch in the evenings after William was asleep, in the particular quiet that follows a child's bedtime, with the stars above them and the crickets sound all around them. She thought about it when he handed her things, a cup or a book or the reins of a horse, with that characteristic gentleness. She thought about it when he laughed at something she said, and the laugh was always genuine, never polite. She was not afraid of loving him. She had moved past that, somewhere in the course of the summer. She was simply waiting for the right moment, in the way that she had learned to wait for things that mattered. The moment came on a Saturday evening in late July. William was asleep. The supper dishes were done. They were on the porch, sitting in the wooden chairs that Oscar had made himself, looking at a sky that was theatrical with stars and a 3/4 moon that laid a silver path across the grassland. The air was warm but not brutal, with a breeze that moved the cottonwood leaves in their particular whispering way. She was aware of him sitting beside her in a way that had become more intense over the weeks, a pleasant, focused awareness of another person who was simply good to be near. She was also aware that she had been waiting long enough and for good enough reasons, and that she was done waiting. She looked at him and found that he was already looking at her, which she suspected he had been doing for a while. "Oscar," she said. "Yes," he said, which wasn't exactly an answer to anything she'd said but was somehow the exact right response. She leaned across the small distance between the chairs and kissed him, simply and with intention, the way she did most things. He was still for the smallest fraction of a moment, surprised, and then he kissed her back with a careful, genuine warmth that was entirely consistent with everything she already knew about him. She pulled back and looked at him in the moonlight. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who had been taken entirely off balance, but in the way of someone who does not mind being taken off balance by a particular thing. "I'm done waiting," she said. "I noticed," he said, and his voice was a little rough and his expression was entirely open, and she loved him. She knew she loved him, clearly and permanently, the way you know when you reach something solid after a long time of uncertain footing. "I love you," she said, because she had learned to say the hard things directly. He reached out and touched her face with the back of his hand, the way he touched careful things, and he said, "I've loved you since September when you looked at a pile of broken plates like they were an interesting problem to be solved." She laughed, and his thumb moved along her cheekbone, and the cottonwoods whispered, and William slept safely inside the house, and the stars did what stars have always done over the Texas grassland, which is burn constant and indifferent and vast and somehow, despite all of that, intimate. The following months were not without difficulty, because life in Hollow Creek in 1882 was not designed to be without difficulty. The summer's good rains gave way to a dry autumn that made the cattle difficult, and the water situation anxious, and Oscar had several weeks of long, hard days that left him tired in ways that showed. Mamie helped where she could, not by pretending to know ranching better than she did, but by keeping the household running well, keeping William occupied and happy, managing the supplies with the competence she brought to anything logistical. She also continued her legal work regarding William with steady persistence. She wrote monthly letters to Mr. Coles. She continued building her financial and personal record. She asked Oscar, carefully and formally, if he would be willing to have the court include the ranch in her character evidence as a stable domestic situation, and he said yes without hesitation, and then said, because they had reached the point of saying such things easily, that he would like it to be more than evidence, that he would like it to be actual and permanent. "Are you proposing to me?" she asked, with the straight-faced quality that he had come to be able to read as amusement. "I'm considering it," he said. "I want to do it properly when I do." "I would like that," she said, "the properly part." He proposed in October, on the porch in the evening, with William asleep inside, and the moon larger than in July, and the cottonwoods in their autumn colors. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet, and he held it out with the same directness and lack of performance that characterized everything he did. "Mamie Gentry," he said, "you are the most capable, honest, remarkable woman I have ever known, and I would like very much to spend the rest of my life being the person who gets to stand next to you while you do everything you're going to do. Will you marry me?" She sat for exactly 1 moment, not from uncertainty but from the fullness of the thing, the weight of arriving somewhere good after a long road. "Yes," she said. "With my whole heart, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and she looked at it in the moonlight, the garnet catching the silver like a small ember, and she thought of everything she had carried to get to this porch, this man, this yes, and she was entirely at peace with all of it because all of it had been necessary. They were married in December, in Hollow Creek's small white church, by Reverend Hughes, who had written that character letter, and who performed the ceremony with a warmth that suggested he found this particular union genuinely satisfying. Ida Bell sat in the front row and cried pleasantly. Fletcher served as Oscar's witness and wore a suit that fit him imperfectly but with great enthusiasm. William sat in the front pew and was extremely well behaved for approximately the first 5 minutes, and then was quietly managed by Ida Bell for the remainder of the ceremony. Mamie wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool because she liked blue and she could sew, and there was no reason to wear anything she hadn't chosen freely. She wore Oscar's mother's ring. She stood next to the man she loved in the small wooden church with the cold December air held outside and the candlelight warm around them, and said her vows with full understanding of what vows were, and what they cost, and what they were worth. This time she knew the difference. This time she had chosen from knowledge and trust and love, rather than from hope and inexperience and optimism alone. This time she was choosing well. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the hotel restaurant. hosted by Mr. Crane, who had by now been presented with enough evidence of Mamie's character to be genuinely fond of her, and the whole town seemed to materialize for it, because Hollow Creek was the kind of small place where a good wedding was a community occasion, and nobody wanted to miss one. There was music. Fletcher played a fiddle with more enthusiasm than technical precision, but with a joy that made up for the gaps. William danced in circles by himself, and then demanded to be picked up by Oscar, and was danced around the room in Oscar's arms with an expression of supreme satisfaction. Mamie stood back for a moment and watched them, her husband and her son, dancing in the lamplight of the hotel restaurant in Hollow Creek, Texas, in December of 1882, and felt the specific happiness of a person who has arrived somewhere that was worth arriving at. Oscar caught her eye across the room and smiled, that quiet, entirely genuine smile, and she smiled back, and it was the simplest and most complete exchange she'd ever had with another person. The new year brought the promised custody review. It was now January of 1883, and Mamie was able to present the court with a picture that was considerably different from the one she'd presented 2 years earlier. A husband with a stable property and income, a house with a proper room for a child, evidence of her continued employment and financial contribution, letters from Reverend Hughes and Ida Bell and Mr. Crane, and one new one from Fletcher, who turned out to write with surprising eloquence about the kind of home he'd watched being made at the Alden Ranch over the past year. Mr. Coles appeared before the judge in Fort Worth on a Thursday in January, and Mamie sat in the courtroom in her blue dress with her hands folded, and answered every question she was asked with full steadiness. The judge granted full custody to Mamie, with reasonable visitation rights for Thomas. It was a complete victory. It was also in the way of complete victories that have been long worked for, almost quiet in its arrival. She thanked Mr. Coles, who was pleased in his precise, composed way. She took the stage back to Hollow Creek and walked out to the ranch from town in the cold January air because she wanted the time to be alone with it. Oscar was at the corral fence when she came up the road, and he saw something in her face before she reached him, and he came off the fence and walked toward her, and she said, "Full custody." And he put his arms around her and held her in the road in the cold January afternoon, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held for a good long moment. "I told you," he said against her hair. "You did," she said. "I believe in you," he said. "I always did." She pulled back and looked at him. The words echoed something back to her, the question she'd been holding in her heart since she'd first arrived in Hollow Creek with a carpetbag and a bruised heart, the question she had carried through every hard month and slow legal movement and quiet patient Friday evening. She had not asked him in words, but she had been asking something like it in every conversation, every moment of honest exchange, every time she had allowed herself to be seen. She had been asking silently whether second chances were real, whether a person who had gotten things wrong and been gotten wrong about could begin again and build something that held. And he had answered her, not in one moment but in 1,000 small, consistent moments, and the answer was yes, and it had always been yes, and it was written plainly and permanently in everything he was. "I know," she said. "I know you do." Spring came again to the Alden Ranch, the second spring Mamie had seen there, and this time there was a garden that was established rather than new, with the marigolds she'd planted the year before reseating themselves along the south wall in a bright, determined row. William helped her plant the vegetables now, with the serious engagement of a 5-year-old who has been trusted with a small trowel and takes the responsibility very seriously. Fletcher got engaged in April to a young woman named Ruth who had come to Hollow Creek with her family from Oklahoma Territory, and the whole ranch was elevated by this development. Oscar shook Fletcher's hand with genuine pleasure. Mamie began planning the wedding quilt that she decided to make as a gift, because it was what she could give that was made rather than bought, and she still believed that made things carried more of the person who made them. By summer, She was expecting their first child. She told Oscar on a morning in June, matter-of-factly but with the warmth she now allowed herself freely. He sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with important things, and then he stood up from the kitchen table and came around to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that was full of a happiness so straightforward it was almost luminous. "A baby," he said. "In the winter, Mr. Coles thinks January." "A January baby," he said. "Same as me." "Is it?" She hadn't known this about him. "January the 4th," he said. "Then it will be in good company," she said. And he kissed her forehead and held her there in the kitchen with the morning light coming in and William's voice audible from the yard, where he was talking to one of the horses in the important, businesslike way he had adopted for all horse-related communications. She worked through the summer with the same practical energy she brought to everything, adjusting as her body required adjustments, refusing to be treated as fragile, which Oscar understood and respected. He did not hover. He did not fuss. He checked on her with the regularity of someone who cared genuinely but knew better than to make caring into controlling. William, told about the baby in August in terms a 5-year-old could process, responded with a sequence of questions that were extremely specific and not always answerable, then concluded that having a baby brother would be acceptable. He had decided it would be a brother with the conviction of a person who does not entertain alternatives. Mamie was privately amused by this certainty and said nothing to challenge it. October was golden and cool and deeply good. Fletcher and Ruth were married in a ceremony considerably louder and more festive than Mamie and Oscar's had been, because Fletcher and Ruth were considerably louder and more festive people, and the ranch hands celebrated long into the evening and Oscar danced with Mamie carefully, one hand at her waist, his other hand holding hers, moving in a small, slow circle on the worn wooden floor of the church hall with her head against his shoulder and the fiddle playing something that wasn't too fast and wasn't too slow. "This is a good life," she said, against his shoulder. "It is," he agreed. "I didn't know if I could get here," she said. "After everything. I didn't know if there was still room for something like this." "There was always room," he said. "You just had to clear the ground first." She thought about that. About the 2 years of clearing, the legal battles and the saving and the patient building of evidence, the lonely room above Ida Bell's and the hard letter and the harder courthouse. About Thomas on the street in February with his careful mustache and his offer of visits. About Mr. Coles in his small office with his large spectacles. About the ride from Abilene with William on the seat, beside her pointing at things through the wagon window. About Oscar coming through a door in September with no warning and knocking her tray clean over and then crouching in the wreckage with genuine mortification and beginning, without either of them knowing it, the rest of her life. "Yes," she said. "I suppose that's it. I had to clear the ground." He held her closer and they swayed in the lamplight of the church hall in Hollow Creek, Texas, in October of 1883, and it was entirely enough. The baby was born in January of 1884, as Mr. Coles had predicted, on a night that was cold enough to put ice on the inside of the window glass, and warm enough inside the ranch house, with the stove burning full that the midwife Mrs. Carver kept taking her shawl on and off. Oscar sat in the kitchen for most of it, which was where men were expected to sit, and William slept through the whole event with the absolute unconscious commitment of a child who has had a long day and sees no reason to interrupt his sleep for an adult development. The baby was a boy. He was a healthy, substantial boy with lungs that worked very well and a head of dark hair, and the particular unfinished beauty of all newborns that is somehow already individual if you look at it correctly. Oscar held him for the first time with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, seated at the kitchen table, the baby in the crook of his arm, looking down at the new face with an expression of such complete openness that Mamie, watching from the doorway where she'd been helped to stand for a moment, felt her heart go entirely full. "What do we name him?" Oscar asked, still looking at the baby. "James," she said, "if you like it, after your father." He looked up at her then, and she saw in his face the thing that went below the usual steadiness, the deep layer of a man who has not expected to be given this kind of gift and does not quite know how to hold it without it overwhelming him. "James," he said. "James Alden," she said, "unless you had something else in mind." "No," he said. "James Alden, that's right, that's exactly right." William woke up the next morning and came into the kitchen and found his parents and his new brother, and after studying the baby for a long, critical moment, pronounced him acceptable and asked if there was breakfast. There was. Mamie made it herself, sitting at the kitchen table with James asleep in the cradle Oscar had built through November and December in the evenings, with William at her elbow eating the biscuits she'd cooked, and Oscar coming in from the morning chores smelling of cold air and horses, and sitting across from her with a cup of coffee, and looking at their family with the quiet, comprehensive satisfaction of a man who knows what he has and values it absolutely. She looked back at him across the table, her husband, this good and patient man who had arrived in her life through a swinging door with the force of something that was meant to happen. And she thought about the long road that had brought her to this kitchen table with this family around her. And she was grateful for every step of it, the hard ones included, because all of it had made this. Spring came again, and the garden bloomed, and William grew and James grew, and the ranch prospered in the modest, real way that good work and good land eventually produce. Not extravagant wealth, but solid sufficiency, the kind of life that is built to last. Fletcher and Ruth had a baby of their own in March, a girl they named Louise, and the two households became the kind of neighboring community that is the particular treasure of frontier life, people who look out for each other because they have chosen to. Mamie continued her work at the hotel restaurant for another year because she valued the independence of her own earnings, and because she was good at it, and because the women of Hollow Creek had come to be her community in a way that she treasured. She eventually moved to working fewer hours when James was old enough to be more demanding, and she found that the ranch itself provided enough to occupy her considerable capacity for work, the garden and the cooking and the accounts, and the planning that a working cattle ranch requires of the people who run it. She and Oscar argued sometimes, because they were both direct people with real opinions, but their arguments were productive in the way that arguments between people who respect each other are productive, finishing not in victory for one side, but in a better understanding than either had started with. She had never had arguments like that before. She had not known arguments could work that way. She wrote to Thomas twice a year regarding his visits with William. The visits happened. They were managed. William grew old enough to manage them himself to a degree, and Mamie made sure that she never said anything to him that would turn him against his father, because William needed his father to be someone he could live with, not someone he'd been taught to resent. This was not easy. It required a discipline she had to consciously maintain. But she maintained it because it was right, and because she had made a decision to do what was right for William even when it cost her. Oscar understood this and said once, on a warm evening on the porch, that watching her do that was one of the most admirable things he'd ever seen a person do. She told him he was being too generous. He told her he was being accurate. They sat with it and moved on to other things, because they had learned together the grace of saying a true thing and not laboring it. James learned to walk in the autumn of 1884, with the aggressive determination of a child who has decided mobility is a right and pursues it accordingly. He was a cheerful and relentless baby who approached everything with enthusiasm and exerted his personality on the household with complete confidence. William, 5 years older, alternated between finding him wonderful and finding him entirely excessive, which was perhaps the most accurate description of having a baby sibling that Mamie had ever encountered. The years moved with the particular texture of good years, felt in the living and appreciated as they happened rather than only in retrospect. Oscar sold cattle at favorable prices in 1885 and used part of the proceeds to add a proper room to the ranch house, and to replace the porch boards that had finally given up entirely. He let William help with some of the lighter ranch work as the boy grew, teaching him with the same patient clarity he brought to all instruction, and William took to it with a competence that surprised no one who had watched him for any length of time. Mamie's second pregnancy was easier than her first, which the midwife Mrs. Carver attributed to her being settled and well-fed, and less anxious than most of the women she attended. The baby came in early spring of 1886, on a morning that was so mild and bright that the windows could be open, which felt like a mercy after the January darkness of James's arrival. This one was also a boy, which William greeted with significantly more equanimity than he'd greeted James, possibly because he'd had 2 years of practice being a brother. They named him Henry, and Henry arrived into the world with the same good lungs and dark hair as his older brother, but a temperament that was noticeably different, quieter, more watchful, already seeming to assess the situation before committing to a response. Oscar said he looked like he was taking notes. Mamie said all babies look like that, and Oscar said not James, and they were both right. The ranch house was full now, and full of the right things. Full of the sounds that a working home makes, cooking and footsteps, and the particular argumentative music of boys at play. Full of the smell of wood smoke and biscuits and fresh air. Full of the small artifacts of a life that is actually being lived rather than just maintained. Mamie's marigolds ran the whole length of the south wall by now. William's room had collected an assortment of books and carved figures, and a hand-drawn map of the ranch that Oscar had helped him make. James and Henry shared the new room, and at night their breathing was audible through the thin wall between rooms, even and deep and entire. She thought sometimes about the woman who had arrived in Hollow Creek with a carpetbag and a bruised heart in the summer of 1882, looking up at a boarding house sign and trying to determine if this town had room for someone who needed to begin again. She felt a tenderness toward that woman that was not self-pity, but something gentler, recognition and compassion for someone who was doing the hardest possible thing with the limited resources available to her. That woman had done it. She had done all of it, the legal battle and the saving and the building, and she had gotten her son, and she had found this man and this life and this home in the red and gold and wide sky country of South Texas, and she had made something worth making. On a warm September evening in 1887, 5 years after she had first walked into the Hotel Crane restaurant and set a tray down in front of an empty corner table, Mamie sat on the front porch of the Alden Ranch house with her husband beside her and watched the sun go down over the Texas grassland in one of those extravagant autumn sunsets that the place produced as though showing off. William was 14 now, tall and capable, out somewhere on the ranch with Fletcher learning something practical. James was 3, asleep inside. Henry was 18 months, also asleep. The house was temporarily quiet in that particular blessed way that houses with small children are quiet when all the small children are simultaneously down. Oscar's hand found hers on the arm of the chair, the way it had found hers 1,000 times in the years between, the same gentle, unhurried claiming that had been consistent from the first time he'd held her hand across a restaurant table in a moment of shared gladness. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a question she had not expected, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was one of those questions that seem so direct it can startle even in a relationship where directness is the norm. She looked at the sunset. She thought about William in the fields learning to be a capable young man. She thought about her boys sleeping inside the house, safe and warm and hers. She thought about the man beside her, this honest and patient cowboy who had come through a door and into her life with no ceremony and no fanfare, and had turned out to be the best thing that had ever happened to her, second only to her children. She thought about the question she had carried in her heart for so long, the unspoken one, the one about whether second chances were real, whether the ground could be cleared and something true built on it. She had her answer. She had been living it for years. "Yes," she said, turning to look at him. completely. He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles with the simplicity of a man who doesn't require grand gestures because the ordinary ones are sufficient. And they sat together in the gold light of the going day in Hollow Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1887, with their life around them, whole and built and real, the kind of life that is worth arriving at, the kind of second chance that turns out to be everything. The cottonwoods moved in the evening breeze with their sound like breathing, the same sound they had made the day she'd arrived, and every day since, steady and alive and deeply rooted, as though the land itself had known all along what was going to grow here, and had simply been waiting for the right people to come along and tend it. She leaned her head against Oscar's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the Texas stars began to appear one by one in the deepening sky. The same stars that had always been above this land, above the long grass and the wide creeks and the honest working people who had made their lives here, constant and clear and without end. Everything she had needed was here. Everything she had worked for was here. Her children, her husband, her home, the quiet daily satisfaction of a life chosen freely and built with intention. She was home. She had been home for a long time, she realized. She had been home from the moment she decided to stay.